Back in his cell in Kilmainham jail, Emmet appears not to have slept at all in the final night of his existence. He stayed up writing letters, writing plans. He wrote out a detailed plan of the rebellion, showing what had been intended, all the different parts of the city which were going to be attacked and how, the use of the pikes, the use of the rockets, and so on. And he prepared this plan for his brother, Thomas Addis Emmet, surely knowing that it would never reach his brother, that would be sent to London. But I think that was also because he wanted to vindicate his future reputation. He wanted to show the British, he wanted to show the world that this hadn't been just some drunken brawl, that this hadn't been just some immature rebellion of a 25-year-old boy, the way the government had made it out to be at his trial. That this had actually been a very sophisticated, calculated plan. And that was why he drew out that very developed plan. And you can actually see how there was a long-term legacy with Emmet's plan. Not only did it influence Pearse, but it actually influenced British military tactics. Because they found the designs of the rockets that Emmet had been working on, and they brought them back to Britain to develop further. And they developed their own rockets, the Congreve rockets, which were used against French ships and against Denmark later on in the Napoleonic Wars. But also, more notably, they were used against the Americans during the War of 1812. And that is why in the American national anthem, they speak of the rocket's red glare. And that is a reference to the rockets that were fired on Fort McHenry and other places. And those rockets were developed out of the rockets that Emmet had worked on for his rebellion in 1803. So Emmet was concerned about his reputation. Emmet was concerned about how future generations viewed him. And that was the point that Emmet was trying to make in his brilliant, powerful speech from the dock. A second letter that Emmet wrote was to his brother. And he talked to him about Sarah Curran. And he pleaded with Thomas Addis Emmet to look after Sarah Curran. He said, treat her as if she was my wife. Love her as if she was your sister. Protect her if she is abandoned by her family. And the third letter he wrote to Sarah Curran directly. Again, he told her how much he loved her. Again, he apologised for everything that he had put her through. Again, he told her about how sorry he was at how everything had turned out. And the next morning, as clergymen and soldiers came to take him away, to bring him to the gallows that had been erected at St. Catherine's Church on Thomas Street, the scene of the crime, the scene where Lord Culwarden had been piked to death, where a huge crowd of 200,000 people had gathered to see the death of Emmet. Well, as Emmet was being led out of his cell, he remembered one task that he had left undone. And he asked for permission to go back into his cell to write one more letter. Now, no one was going to refuse the last request of a condemned man. So he was brought back into his cell in Kilmainham and given writing paper and equipment. And he sat down and almost without pausing for thought, he jotted out a one-page letter. And that was a letter for the Chief Secretary, William Wickham, the brilliant British intelligence spy master, the man who in his own words had done more than anyone else to capture Emmet and bring him to his death. And that letter would arrive on Wickham's desk 2 hours after Emmet had been executed, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. And after finishing the letter, Emmet turned it over, sealed it, and said, "I am now quite prepared." And he was led away to the gallows, and in the carriage on the way, the two clergymen debated with him and they said, "Surely you must be sorry for this rebellion. Surely you must be sorry." And Emmet replied, "No, I can stand over it. This was intending to do something very good." And he argued with them point by point. And when he reached the gallows, he asked for permission to give another speech. But that had been refused because the government, they hadn't really rated him before, but the power of his speech from the dock had convinced them otherwise, and they didn't want him inciting the crowd that had gathered, so they refused. So instead, Emmet just said a simple line. He said, "I die with sentiments of universal love and kindness towards all men." Now, the British government had confidently predicted that Emmet would wince when about to experience the terror of execution. And that was because, as we have talked about before, hanging was a horrific, brutal thing. If you were particularly light, and Emmet was very small and thin and light, you could be left hanging for half an hour as the rope would just suffocate you to death. And that's why so many of the great highwaymen and even rebels of the 18th century got drunk beforehand. Many of them threw up beforehand. Many of them broke down in tears and pleaded for mercy. And the government said, this is what Emmet will do. We will break him. 200,000 people have gathered and we will humiliate him. We will break him. He will crumble. He will collapse. He will be afraid. But Emmet showed no fear on the scaffold. He knew that he could win a greater victory by the way that he died than he had by the way he had lived. He helped the hangman put the noose around his own neck. He shook hands with the executioner. He gave him some money and his watch. He gave that speech about dying with universal love and kindness towards all men. And then the executioner asked him, "Are you ready, sir?" And that was to be the signal for Emmet to say yes, and they would kick the plank from under his feet and he would fall to his death. But he replied, "Not yet." And the executioner asked him a second time, "Are you ready, sir?" And Emmet replied, "Not yet." And we will never know who or what Emmet was waiting for in those final moments of his life. And the third time the executioner asked him, "Are you ready, sir?" And whatever Emmet tried to say, the executioner lost patience, kicked the plank from under him, and he fell to his death. And he died bravely without a struggle or a cry. And his body was left hanging for more than half an hour just to make sure that he was dead. And then they took it down, put it on a table, and the executioner took out a blade, sliced the head off, and held it up saying, "This is the head of the traitor Robert Emmet. This is the head of the traitor." And the blood from the body seeped down into the gutters, where dogs came to lap it up, and old women came to dip their handkerchiefs in it and take it away as a souvenir, because the blood of a martyr was said to have healing properties. And the body and head were taken back to Kilmainham jail, where a death mask was made of the head. And then after that, we don't know. More than 200 years on, no one in the world knows where the head and body of Robert Emmet ended up. It's possible that his family came and took the body and put it in maybe the family crypt. It's possible that it was buried somewhere else by his supporters. It was possible that the British government buried it in a pit of lime so that it could never turn into a shrine for nationalist pilgrimages. And W.B. Yeats had a beautiful reflection on that as well. He said, if that's what happened to the body, if the British government had destroyed it to stop it turning into a shrine for nationalist pilgrimages, then they have failed, because by doing so, they have made all of Ireland his tomb. And so, without knowing it, Emmet's final words in his speech from the dock came to pass. It proved impossible for Ireland to write his epitaph because there was no gravestone, there was no grave. No one knew where he was buried. And so the idea of Ireland taking her place among the nations of the earth became a rallying cry for future generations of patriots. It inspired John Mitchell and the Young Irelanders in 1848. And in fact, Mitchell's lawyer, his defence lawyer, was Robert Holmes, who was the brother-in-law of Robert Emmet. He had married Robert Emmet's sister. And he was imprisoned at the time of the rebellion. When he returned home a year later, his wife died upon seeing him return home, having lost so much. Sarah Curran had a tragic afterlife to this story. She suffered from nightmares for the rest of her life. She was kicked out of her family home. But then she did something which shocked later generations of Irish nationalists. She married a British soldier. And that was written out of the histories. But I think Emmet wouldn't have begrudged her any of her future happiness. He would have been glad that she found happiness somewhere. He had no hatred towards Britain. It was love of Ireland that had motivated him. And I suspect he would have preferred to see her married to a British soldier than a French soldier. And for a brief time, Sarah Curran found happiness with her British husband. And they were stationed in Sicily, and there she became pregnant. But all her life she suffered from premonitions. She would wake up in the middle of the night shaking, thinking about the events of 1803. And she had a premonition that she would go into labour on board a ship. And when her husband was stationed, sent back to England, she begged to be allowed to stay in Sicily until the baby was born. But the British refused, and so they were sent back. And in the middle of winter, in the middle of a storm at sea, she went into labour and delivered her baby, a son who she called John, after her beloved older brother. And the son, because he was born in such difficult circumstances, did not survive. He lasted only a few weeks, and then he died. And she was so heartbroken. She said the scarf and hat that she was knitting for him would now have to act as a death shroud. And she gave up all interest in life. Crushed by everything that had happened to her, the loss of Emmet, the loss of her baby, her relationship breaking down with her father, she gave up on life, and she died a few weeks later. She said, "I just want to die so I can go to heaven, so I can look after my baby there." And in many ways, the death of Sarah Curran in 1808 marks her out as the last victim of the Robert Emmet Rebellion. But in subsequent nationalist mythology, she was immortalised as someone who had died of a broken heart because she never got over Emmet. She was immortalised by Thomas More as someone who she is far from the land, meaning that she had been buried in Sicily, even though in fact she had been buried in Cork, buried on Irish soil. So in a way, the myth-making that surrounded Sarah Curran was part of the myth-making that accompanied so many of these Irish nationalist stories. 2 hours after Emmet's death, his final letter reached the desk of William Wickham, the British spy master. And when he received it and was told the circumstances in which it had been written, he was expecting a letter full of bitterness and anger and resentment. And he was shocked when he opened it to discover that instead it was a letter full of toleration, hope and forgiveness. And in it, Emmet explained that if he'd been allowed to deliver the speech from the dock that he had intended, before all of those interruptions by Lord Norbury, he would have actually said that it wasn't hatred of Britain that motivated him, it was love of Ireland. That he wanted Ireland to have the same relationship with Britain that the United States had, that they could work together peacefully once Ireland was free and independent. And that actually he was thinking of hoping to try and exonerate Wickham from any blame. And Wickham was so moved by what he called the very Christian sentiments in this letter that Emmet in his final moments hadn't been concerned about his own fate, but about other people, that he lost all faith in the British government. And he used the excuse of a knee injury 6 months later to resign from the British government. And in his resignation letter, he explained that he could not continue to support a government that he felt was ruling unjustly in Ireland. He could not continue to support a government that wouldn't give Catholics full rights in Ireland. And crucially, he could not support a government in Ireland that would force a man as young, as brilliant, as talented as Emmet into leading a rebellion against all the odds, and for paying for that with his life. And Wickham was never trusted by the government again, and he spent the remainder of his years in exile in Switzerland with his wife. And 30 years later, whenever he would meet strangers from Ireland or Britain, as soon as he would find out where they were from, he would take them into the nearest tavern, buy them a pint of something, sit down with a pint of his own, take out a blank sheet of paper, and he would write out from memory Emmet's final letter to him, because he believed that this letter offered a vision of hope for the future. He believed that this letter was Emmet's lasting legacy, that this showed how Ireland and Britain could exist peacefully together in the future. He believed that this letter of toleration and hope should be the inspiration to Irish people and British people for centuries to come. Now, there's always been a lot of talk in Ireland about if you ever found out where Emmet was buried, what epitaph would you write? or even a debate about has Ireland taken her place among the nations of the earth. But if you were to consider writing Emmet's epitaph, if you were to think about what words you could write on that gravestone, I think there are no finer words that you could inscribe than the words of his greatest enemy, William Wickham, who 30 years later said, "Had I been an Irishman, I would most unquestionably have joined him."